According to a 2003 article by Lynn Harris, the only way to make leavened bread for millennia was with sourdough, from at least the time of ancient Egypt until the turn of the 20th century. With only flour, water, and time, bakers were able to tame wild yeast and use it to make their breads fluffy and light. Today, making your own sourdough at home, or even in your dorm room like I'm doing, is a delicious and rewarding way to return to the basics of bread baking. Before we begin, we'll need to gather all of our ingredients. We need whole wheat or rye flour, water, molasses or honey, and regular white or wheat flour for feeding after the first 2 or 3 days. We'll also need some additional supplies, including a jar or non-reactive container. Glass, ceramic, plastic, or stainless steel are common. Measuring utensils for liquid and dry ingredients, and a spoon for stirring the starter. You'll also need a warm place, at least room temperature, to let the starter sit and ferment overnight. To create a sourdough starter from scratch, the expert bakers at King Arthur Flour recommend in their 2003 Baker's Companion using a roughly 1-to-1 ratio by weight of flour and water. Add a few drops of molasses, although this is optional. For my mini dorm room friendly starter, I used 3 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water. According to the Kitchen's 2008 Sourdough Guide, it's possible to make a starter with just about any flour, but whole rye or whole wheat is ideal since it hosts more natural yeast than all-purpose flour. After the first 2 or 3 days, there should be enough yeast growing that you can switch to regular flour, if you should so choose. In the non-reactive container, measure out rye flour and water in the 3-to-2 tablespoon ratio prescribed earlier. Again, I use tablespoons to make a manageably small amount. Add a drop or 2 of molasses to kickstart the yeast, mix it together, cover the container, and then hands off for 24 hours. This is when the magic happens. In other words, the yeast begins to ferment. Fermentation is the key to sourdough. This is what gives bread its airy texture and sour flavor. When we feed the starter, we're really feeding the wild yeast found on the flour. When yeast, a tiny fungus, interacts with bacteria called lactobacilli, it grows and produces carbon dioxide, which can be seen as bubbles in both the starter and in the finished bread. The sour flavor comes from acids produced by the lactobacilli. Similar to the way we humans often prepare our food before eating it, the complex carbohydrates in flour must be prepared before the yeast can use them. Lactobacilli break down the carbs and turn them into simple sugars that the yeast can consume. Lactic acid and acetic acid, which have a sour flavor, are byproducts of this reaction. The next day, we'll stir up the starter and discard half of it, then repeat the steps from yesterday minus the molasses. Then it's 24 more hours of fermentation. On day 3, we can abandon our rye flour and switch to something finer. I use simple, unbleached, all-purpose flour. As before, we'll stir it up, then discard half the starter. Then we mix in the flour and water in a 2-to-1 ratio. Again, I'm using tablespoons. Starting today, the starter will need to be fed every 12 hours, or as close as possible. This process will continue for at least another 4 days, though the time frame may vary depending on the environment. A mature starter should double in size within a few hours of feeding. To bake with it, feed it about 6 to 8 hours before preparing the dough. The best time to use it is right after it's peaked or reached its highest point in the container. Once the starter is mature, we don't have to feed it every 12 hours if we're not baking with it immediately. A starter can be kept on the kitchen counter and fed once a day to keep it active, or in the refrigerator with weekly feedings. If it's fed less often, the starter may go dormant and form a layer of dark liquid on top, alcohol. Our goal is bread, not moonshine, so we need to either pour this off or stir it back into the starter and feed it to return it to an active state. If a dormant starter begins to get moldy with blue or pink spots or starts to smell truly rancid, it's probably time to dump it out and begin afresh. Once started, these sourdoughs can last years or even decades if they're properly cared for. They can truly become a tradition with roots as old as the pyramids. Although sourdough starter takes some time and effort to make, I've found that it's a worthwhile and satisfying process that anyone with some time and simple ingredients can undertake.